Americans have been struggling to pay for housing costs. In July 2020, an estimated 32% of Americans missed a rent or mortgage payment. That was up from 24% in April, 31% in May, and 30% in June. This trend is worrying experts that a wave of evictions may be coming once local, state, and federal moratoria on forced removals expire.
The eviction process itself is a barrier to maintaining personal and public health.
Struggling to pay for housing in America is nothing new. In 2018, the Census Bureau estimated that 40.6% of renters were rent-burdened, meaning they spent 35% or more of their monthly income on rent and utilities. A study by Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies found that about a quarter of households spent more than half their income on housing.
They're frequently having to choose between paying for food or paying for housing, and the rent always eats first.
The Urban Institute found that about a quarter of Black and Latinx renters surveyed didn't pay or deferred their rent in May 2020, compared to 14% of white renters.
Rents are like out of control. I mean, people can't even afford to live in these cities anymore, and these are people who have good jobs.
No pagué mi renta por cubrir todo lo demás y he estado sin dormir pensando y pensando, what is going to happen when everything is opened again y se desaparezca la ayuda? What's going to happen? Am I going to make the same money as I was making before?
With the growing uncertainty over financial stability and the idea that mass evictions may be looming, how do evictions actually work? And could the US cancel rent? From 2000 to 2016, there were almost 1 million evictions per year in the United States, meaning that about 1 in 40 renter households were evicted per year.
In 2016, we saw 3.7 million eviction filings, which comes to about 7 eviction filings per minute. These are experiences that we're hearing about across the country right now. It is not just a red or a blue state issue. It's not just an urban issue.
Along with systemic racism, rising rents and home prices, stagnant wages, gentrification, and a decline in public and subsidized housing are contributing to this very complex problem.
The Great Migration states, so in the South, Midwest, and Rust Belt, these are often the hotspots of evictions, and that's very much tied to the legacy of slavery and racial discrimination in housing.
According to census data, from the 1950s to 2000, gross rents, which includes utilities, rose from $384 to $901. By 2010, that number grew to $1,010, and by 2018, it was $1,086. At the same time, wages have been stagnating. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics analyzed by the Pew Research Center suggests that from 1964 to 2018, average hourly wages went up from $20.27 to $22.65, or just $2.38. Combined with the loss of millions of affordable housing units since the 1990s, a crisis has been created for low-income Americans.
For poor people and the working poor, every day is a rainy day. They're just trying to figure out who to pay and who not to pay. That's kind of like the game that they play every month.
Solamente estoy sobreviviendo. I'm just surviving, just living, Esto no es vida.
An eviction can be one of the most emotionally traumatizing experiences that a family has ever had. They first receive a notice on the door that they're going to be evicted, that the sheriff will be coming in a matter of days. And then if they don't leave on their own accord, the sheriff comes in and their belongings are forcibly removed from the home. This is usually happening while children and family members are standing by and watching.
The legal process to evict a tenant can be broken down as follows.
There are 5 stages in eviction: the initiation, so notice to tenant, filing of the lawsuit, the actual hearing, the court order, and then the sheriff execution of that order.
Some landlords engage in intimidation tactics to get tenants to leave, which sometimes leads to what are known as self-help evictions.
Self-help means the landlord has not resorted to starting a court case, has not done the preliminary notices, has not filed the court cases, just literally locked out the person or locked them out and thrown their things out as well.
This is illegal in almost every state in the country.
The landlord is subject to damages, not just for the eviction itself, but in a separate court, the tenant can also sue for any damages to property.
Depending on the state, a landlord may have to pay fines, damages, and the tenant's court and attorney fees. And if a tenant wins the suit, the landlord may be required to let the tenant stay in the unit.
It's the reason why it is because 90% of landlords have a lawyer and 90% of tenants don't.
Some universities offer law students as representation under the tutelage of certified law professors, like the housing clinic at Michigan State University.
I would say we get 15 calls a day, various things. And then we have a court program. So on Thursday, we're actually at a court where people who are being sued come in.
Which brings up questions about access to counsel in the United States.
The Gideon case came before the Supreme Court, and it was decided at that point that if you were facing criminal procedures, that you need a right to an attorney.
Like when someone is read their Miranda rights when they are arrested.
But the same right has never been afforded to civil matters, such as matters of housing, matters of public health.
To fight against this, some cities have enacted access to counsel initiatives.
The American Bar Association passed a resolution almost a decade ago in favor of the civil right to counsel. And it's a movement that I think is largely growing. We don't have any states that have adopted it yet at the state level, but there are numerous cities that have adopted a civil right to counsel, especially in housing, and have demonstrated that just that one intervention resulted in upwards of 80% of cases not resulting in a sheriff's enforcement of an order.
Keep in mind that most of the programs that provide free lawyers are for very low-income people. It does not include working poor. So, there are limitations on the income levels.
Evictions can have serious repercussions on the tenant and the community at large.
We call it the Scarlet E because when you've gone through the eviction process, it ruins your credit and often can cause you to be blacklisted by other landlords.
The major credit bureaus took action to try to solve this.
Back in 2017, the three credit bureaus, the major ones, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, they got together and they no longer report evictions on credit reports.
But it hasn't stopped the label from following tenants who have been evicted.
Credit bureaus aren't necessarily reporting that you had an eviction on your record, but there is you have the ability to search the records, and there are numerous companies that have popped up across the country for the sole purpose of culling through eviction records to make that available to property owners. So you can pay those companies to search the record for you to determine if this applicant for tenancy is on one of those lists.
So it becomes very difficult to find housing once you have been evicted. So it also increases the rate of homelessness and other traumatic events and experiences.
According to a White House report from 2019, over 500,000 people are homeless in the US on any given night. 65% of those are sheltered, while the other 35% are on the streets. And a recent report by Amherst Capital Management found that 28 million renters who don't own their homes or receive financial assistance are at risk of eviction. But tenants aren't the only ones who suffer when rent isn't paid.
The rent itself has ripple effects for the entire community. When the rent isn't paid, the mortgage isn't paid, property taxes go unpaid, employees are unpaid, conditions that needed repairs are delayed, and the entire community ends up suffering, from the school system to services that the community provides to residents.
It's probably a bit more difficult for the smaller landlord. One of the things that we've been working on internally and with our peers in the space is putting forth a proposal to Washington, to Treasury and HUD that's really a simple program for short-term liquidity relief, designed much like a long-term interest-free loan administered through the tax system. So that's something that we'll continue to work on for the benefit of all renters, the 47 million households in the US that rent today.
A May survey by the American Apartment Owners Association found that nearly 60% of landlords said their tenants are unable to pay rent because of the coronavirus, and 80% said they're willing to work with their tenants.
We made it pretty clear to our landlords that people aren't just suddenly going to be able to afford to pay back everything they owe on one day, right? So it doesn't make sense to create a plan that isn't realistic.
Landlords can use their insurance for things like natural disasters, but COVID-19 has not been deemed one. And a Marsh and McLennan report showed that insurance rates are going up amid the pandemic because companies are seeing it as a higher risk. The American Apartment Owners Association said there is something that landlords can do to ease some of that burden.
They can get something called lease guarantee, so that if later the tenant can't pay their rent or there's excessive damages or something like that, they have some coverage for that. And we call it a security deposit alternative. So it allows people to not have to pay a full security deposit, And then, the landlord is protected for thousands of dollars just in case something happens down the road. It is a small fee that the tenant has to pay to get it, but it is definitely less than what a security deposit would be.
Today I'm also announcing that the Department of Housing and Urban Development is providing immediate relief to renters and homeowners by suspending all foreclosures and evictions until the end of April.
The president was referring to an amendment in the CARES Act, which provides eviction relief for tenants in federally backed housing for 120 days, and the notice must give tenants 30 days to leave the property. You can look on the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac websites to see if your apartment building's mortgage is federally backed. And even if they're not, the Eviction Lab has a policy scorecard which is constantly updating information on states' housing policy during the pandemic.
The most important thing to know is that there are lots of holes. The eviction moratoria are probably best described as a patchwork. So there are some places around the country where there are little to no protections in place from eviction.
On June 29th, HUD's Federal Housing Finance Agency extended the ability for multifamily property owners that already had forbearance agreements an extra 3 months of forbearance, with the requirement that landlords give the tenant at least a 30-day notice to vacate, not charge the tenant late fees or penalties for non-payment of rent, and allow the tenant flexibility to repay back rent over time and not in a lump sum. Because of this patchwork, the House of Representatives passed the Emergency Housing Protections and Relief Act of 2020, which would appropriate $100 billion for direct rental assistance, something that was not expressly written into the $2.2 trillion CARES Act. The bill passed by the House has a companion bill in the Senate, but both bills are not expected to pass in the upper chamber, even though President Trump says he supports larger payments to Americans than Democrats in the next coronavirus relief bill. A movement also developed to #CancelRent.
All across the country, from Los Angeles, Philadelphia to New York, tens of thousands of tenants banded together in the largest coordinated rent strike in decades.
Workers are staging protests nationwide on this International Workers' Day, also known as May Day.
In Congress, Representative Ilhan Omar introduced the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act of 2020 to cancel rent until 30 days after the pandemic is over.
Today, I'm excited to introduce a bill to cancel all rent and home mortgage payments through the duration of this pandemic.
The bill has 30 co-sponsors in the House, but is still waiting for a vote in the House Financial Services Committee.
No matter where I was or what I was doing, I could always come here. This was home. But it's wait and see what happens.
As Americans wait for a possible next step from Washington, experts suggest people who are concerned about their rent speak with their landlords.
This is difficult for everyone involved, and we're really trying to encourage as much cooperation, and that goes both ways. So I think it's really important that tenants talk to their landlords if they're having a problem and to be honest with them. And for landlords at the same time to not think the worst and to also have an open mind and work with their tenants as well if they can.